question. We're not reading this wrong, right?
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. We'll get right into the topic at hand shortly. Wonderful to see everybody. This is session 2 of our 4 sessions on Great High Holiday sermons for today. We're inching forward in history. Last week, we read a sermon of Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb from 1973. This sermon is from 1984, making it 40 years ago this high holiday season. We will then backtrack significantly in history, about 100 years to Rav Amiel, and then conclude with the most contemporary with Rabbi Sharon Brous. So that's our history timeline, all 20th to 21st century. There certainly are, in many years ago, we learned a very famous Rosh Hashanah sermon of the Ramban. So you could go back, many centuries and study high holiday sermons, but we're looking at modern, close to contemporary ones. Just situating the current moment that we're in, I don't think we're going to look at this sermon, but I was very struck as I was reading some of Rav Amiel's sermons. He comments on a sermon that he wrote, which he delivered. Each of his high holiday sermons indicate that they were delivered before the shofar blasts began, which is our custom in HIR also, so as not to interrupt the flow of shofar from the very first of the 100 blasts to the very end. So he delivered his sermons before shofar blowing began. And this sermon, which was delivered, again, not the one we're looking at today, just an aside because it's fresh in my mind, this sermon, which he delivered in 1914, just a few months after the outbreak of World War I. And he says, what a horrible year it's been. He says, the worst year since the destruction of the Second Temple. And he says it was a year in which we experienced the verse that describes the creation of the world. The world was tohu vavohu, chaos and upheaval, v'choshech al pnei tehom, with darkness over the face of the deep. He said the only difference between that verse and our experience today is that verse continues, Ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim, the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. But in our day, Ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hadam, God's presence hovers over the seas of blood that have been spilt, and goes on to talk about something that was a very kind of significant trauma for the Jewish people in World War I, which was that there were large groups of Jews fighting on both sides, Jews fighting against Jews. Anyway, just in the backdrop of a year of war, thinking about different moments of wartime drashot and what they spoke about. He actually speaks in that drasha about an unhealthy obsession with war, which he felt that his community had already picked up. Anyway, lots to think about. This one, the sermon we're going to look at of Rabbi Michal, really takes us in a different direction, I think, than Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb's, and then the one of which I just briefly mentioned now, in that it feels a little bit more out of time, and not specifically tethered to current events. 1984 was not a particularly traumatic year in Israeli history. There were a number of terrorist attacks that year. There was an Egged bus that was taken hostage for a period of time with everyone on board, which was ultimately resolved. But it was no year is a simple year, but it certainly wasn't one of the hardest years in Israeli history. But it's also, so maybe there was nothing that felt immediately pressing of the most, cataclysmic current events to address. We're also remembering always that our audience and our setting is important. This was delivered in yeshiva to yeshiva students. And so both, I think, its capacity to speak to an already fully engaged audience, where kind of commitments are already ironclad, and maybe the focus is more on the spiritual dimension alone. It's also much more textually thick, I would say. If Rabbi Lamb, introduced sort of one idea, expanding upon a pasuk, although we had a number of texts and developing the life story of Rabbi Eliezer the Great that we studied last week. This one really attempts to weave together a whole host of texts, not in an overly complex way. It wasn't a sheer. You can feel as you're reading that it's not a complex sheer, but it does aim to kind of build a through line and a theme through a series of texts. I think it also, has less. Again, I don't know what it was like to hear it in the room, but it has less kind of homiletical, rhetorical technique and flourish. I think because speaking to an audience for whom the power of the texts that are being quoted, speak for themselves, and just kind of juxtaposing them and developing the idea that comes out of them, was enough. Rav Amital was a remarkable figure. I met Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb only a few times. Rav Amital I had the privilege to know a little bit better by virtue of having been a student in Yeshivat Har Etzion, where he was the Rosh Yeshiva for many, many years, the founding Rosh Yeshiva. And I was a student there in 98, 99, when he was still a daily presence in the Beit Midrash. His son-in-law, Rav Brin, sat just a few seats over from me. And so when Rav Amital would come into the Beit Midrash in the morning, he would always stop by Rav Brin's makom. Rav Brin, I've mentioned here before, was someone who developed a sleeping problem because of having stayed up, most of the night for some stretch of time studying Torah. He developed a sleeping problem, and he would often take a morning nap and be sleeping a few seats down from me in my row in the Beit Midrash. And Rav Amital, I don't know how he walked in his earlier years, but here he was in his 70s, and he plodded. He really plodded. He shuffled into the Beit Midrash, and sometimes Rav Brin would sense him coming and stir, and sometimes Rav Amital would walk by and just gently place a hand on Rav Brin's shoulder, and Rav Brin would turn and see his father-in-law, the Rosh Yeshiva, and jump to his feet. And I would also jump to my feet. And I was just privy to those kind of tender moments many a morning, and just to see the yeshiva kind of stir as Rav Amital would come in. He walked along the kind of center aisle and made his way to his makom, his seat, which was in the front of the Beit Midrash. At that time, he and the late Rav Aaron Lichtenstein were the two Roshei Yeshiva. They had their seats on the two front opposite sides of the Aron Kodesh. They had their tables in the front. And, he would often, as he went in, stop by a student here or there and engage them in conversation. He was incredibly loving, gentle, personable, soft kind of personality, and soft-spoken. He was a Holocaust survivor, and someone who occupied a fascinating place in the intersection of yeshiva and public affairs. And towards his later years, he was involved in a left of center political party called Meimad, and spent a little bit of time in the government. He was really the developer of the notion of the Hesder Yeshiva, the yeshiva which combined the program which combined military service and yeshiva learning, a 5-year program which had segments of both, and founded Yeshivat Har Etzion, really one of the premier Hesder yeshivot, located in Aron Shvut in Gush Etzion. He invited Rav Lichtenstein to join him as co-Rosh Yeshiva, which was an unusual model at the time. We now see a little bit more of that. And they were very much a kind of yin and yang personalities in the yeshiva. And he was just a remarkable person, a bridge to another world, but very, very much someone who didn't only live in the world from which he came, but was very preoccupied with in a certain way, similar to how we spoke about Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb's reflections on the generations of American Jews and their relationship to sermons. He was very much aware of the younger generations, what was the nature of their connection to Judaism, what were the ways in which, in a world of modernity, they didn't feel an innate sense of obligation in the way that prior generations did, and he understood the duty that Jewish leaders and rabbis had to meet people where they were at and bring them to a deeper place of connection. He was really a sensitive and extraordinary soul. Many Yehudas and Amitals, came into the world soon after he died, named in his memory. And his sichot, his speeches that were given in yeshiva, and his other writings, have and even continue to be published. A book was just published, some of his writings. Really just a remarkable person, born in 1924, died in 2010, Rabbi Yehuda Amital. So this drasha of his I chose in large part because there is an English translation that more or less parallels the Hebrew, so that we could access it in both. We're obviously going to read along in the English version, and try to distill how does he communicate his message, and what is his message for us as we approach the high holidays. As we mentioned again last week, now already as we kind of go week to week, we'll be able to develop some comparisons and contrasts. Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb was, not actually a high holiday drasha. It was a sermon that was very much on the themes of approaching the new year and the moment in which it was being given. But it was for one of the last parshiot in the month of Elul, whereas this one was delivered on Rosh Hashanah, 1984. Let me share my screen and we will begin to look at it. So.
This is just adapted by, but it's read.
Yes. For those who are looking on, it says adapted by Aviad HaKohen, who was a student of his, who I think both did the translation and slight editing. I'm going to try to note there's at least one significant spot where there's a little bit more expansion and development in the Hebrew version that was not brought into the English version. I want to make sure we get that, because it's actually a spot where I think the English alludes to something but is insufficient to get the point of it. So and this is taken from one of his multiple books of speeches that were delivered in the context of the yeshiva. This one called The Cry of the Heart. The Hebrew is actually called Yichuda Shel Tfilat Rosh Hashanah, the unique nature of the Rosh Hashanah liturgy. So we'll sort of see how those come together. Okay. This is called The Cry of the Heart, again from Rosh Hashanah in 1984, delivered by Rabbi Yehuda Amital in Yeshivat Haaretz. And he begins. The Gemara discusses the desired shape of a shofar and its connection to one's attitude in prayer. He quotes from the Talmud. Rabbi Levi said, the religious duty of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is performed with a curved shofar, kafuf, and on other days of the year with a straight shofar. But we learn, elsewhere it says, that the shofar of Rosh Hashanah was a straight one of an antelope's horn. I'm not an expert in shofars, but there is, I don't know if it's the kudu, there are some animals that have an absolutely straight horn that is kosher as a shofar and can be blown. We generally don't see that. I don't know if there are communities, other ethnic Jewish communities that do blow a straight shofar. We typically blow a ram's horn, which is curved, either curved or even kind of spiraling. But there is a kosher shofar, which is straight. And this is what the Gemara is discussing. Which is it? What is the basis of this dispute? One authority holds that on Rosh Hashanah, this is still the Gemara talking, one authority holds that on Rosh Hashanah, the more a man, so to speak, bends his mind, the more effective is his prayer. The other authority holds that on Rosh Hashanah, the more a man straightens his mind, the better the effect. Okay, so we already are understanding, as he says at the outset, somehow the shofar is meant to reflect or prescribe our mindset. Are we supposed to be kafuf, bent, maybe somehow submissive, or are we supposed to be pashut, kind of straight, direct, and unbent? Rashi comments, explaining what these ideas mean. What does it mean for your mind or mindset to be bent as opposed to straight? The more a man, so to speak, bends his mind during his prayers, his face being directed towards the ground. Okay, so we've sort of shifted a little bit from da'at to posture, your mindset, to actually kind of the way you position yourself. So if you bend your mind, it's also somehow reflects bending your body. That means your face is directed towards the ground. The more effective is his prayer, because the passage from Malachim, which says that God says, "My eyes and heart shall be there at the temple perpetually." Therefore, since the shofar on Rosh Hashanah serves as an instrument of prayer and of arousing the memory of the binding of Isaac, a curved shofar is required. Rabbi Amital is going to come back to this later on to try to flesh it out a little bit more, but we've been trying to put the pieces together. The idea somehow seems to be that the binding of Isaac took place at what is somehow imagined to be the future site of the temple. Har HaMoriah, Mount Moriah, becomes the Temple Mount. And so we want to kind of orient ourselves towards the temple. And somehow that's like, even though we sort of think of the Temple Mount as upwards, but somehow we're sort of like pointing ourselves towards like the ground of the temple. We're like looking down as though to look at the floor surface of the temple. And that's where God is, and therefore we want to direct ourselves there. So that's the bent. The more a man straightens his mind, this is continued Rashi's comment on the Talmud, the more a man straightens his mind, the better the effect, because let us lift up our heart with our hands to God in the heavens. Therefore, the mitzvah is performed on Rosh Hashanah with a straight shofar, because it is for prayer. And again, somehow even straight is, when we look straight, we're not looking down. And so somehow that's, even though it's not quite upwards, it's oriented in a kind of an upwards direction, looking straight ahead. You can look out to the horizon, that's somehow up as opposed to down. Again, these are all agadic texts. We can interpret them in other ways, maybe even in contradictory ways. This is how Rashi explains it to us. In these texts, the sages try to teach us a fundamental principle of prayer. Sometimes it is actually the pashtut. And now Rav Amital goes from pashut, meaning straight, a kind of positioning or orientation, to its broader sense, which is pashut means simple. The more a person not just is straight, but is simple, the more effective their prayer will be. Okay? It is actually the pashut, the straightness, directness, and simplicity of a cry from the heart. Now, again, we already have another level of interpretation. What does it mean to be simple? It means just cry out from your heart. Don't get overly sophisticated. The fancy, liturgical poetry is not the focus. It's the simple cry of the heart that adds a deeper dimension to prayer. Quoting, their heart cried out to the Lord. In the end, it's the cry of the heart. Rabbi Simcha Bunim of Pshischa further developed this idea, and we're going to see, a series of paragraphs in which Rav Amital basically says a further point or another development or another dimension. They're not, complex transitions, but he's building, he's amassing a case on this theme of simplicity. Rabbi Simcha Bunim of Pshischa further developed this idea when he reinterpreted the words of the morning prayer, Habocher b'shirei zimra, the one who chooses musical songs of praise, as Habocher b'shiarei zimra, the one who chooses remnants of praise. Shiarim are leftovers. We're on the second side of the first page here for those who have it. I'm sorry, I don't have page numbers. If you turn that first page over, third paragraph towards the end, to teach us that God desires specifically those remnants that remain deep in the heart of a person, the elements that represent the truth that is in him. Shiarim, leftovers, remnants, that's kind of something you got to dig deep to find. And Rabbi Simcha Bunim of Pshischa says, what is God? God doesn't just want our fancy, elegant songs. God wants us to dig down and say, what are the crumbs that are left that maybe we've been avoiding, neglecting, something deep down in our heart? That's what God chooses and wants us to bring out in front of God. Okay? The Talmud Yerushalmi gives further expression to this concept. Why do we blow the shofar using horns? To say, relate to us as if we are bellowing like animals before you. Okay, this is an interesting idea, that the ram's horn, we have a lot of different interpretations of it, but the Talmud Yerushalmi sort of says we actually want to get in touch with the animal, our most base sense, kind of a primal, innate instinct inside of us. As he goes on to say, the reference to bellowing like animals represents the natural cry that bursts out, that is born of fear and comes straight from the heart, right? So again, there's so much deep thinking that needs to go into teshuvah and into connecting to God. There is so much elaborate prayer, and Rav Amital is saying to us, but when the Gemara talks about why we use different shofarot, it makes the argument for a straight shofar, which is based on the idea that the mindset of a person should be pashut, should be simple, and simple means something deep inside, something very basic and instinctive that's not, doesn't get kind of caught up in all the webs of complexity of our prayer and of our kind of philosophy of today. We find a similar phenomenon expressed in the redemption from Egypt. The verse, "and their cry rose up to God from the bondage," is explained by the Or HaChaim. From the bondage does not mean that they cried out to God to save them, but rather that they cried out from anguish, like a person who cries out in pain. Explaining what's going on here, the verse that he's quoting is Vatal Shavatam El HaElohim Min HaAvodah, right? Their cry went up to God from the hard labor. He's saying they didn't actually pray to God in an intentional way. Well, there was no prayer. They were crying out from the back-breaking work, and that's what went up to God. You don't even need to craft a prayer. You just need to have that deep sigh of anguish of the situation. That in and of itself is a prayer. The text informs us that this cry of theirs reached God. As it says, their cry from the bondage, i.e. their cry was from the pain of their work, right? Clearing everything out, to just have that krechts, that cry is what the Talmud that Rav Amital is further developing and adding on different arguments to support, is kind of telling us is the mode of Rosh Hashanah. A similar idea is inherent in an understanding of the different ways in which we blow the shofar. The rule that the length of a teruah blow is the equivalent of 3 sobs is learned in the Gemara from the cries of Sisra's mother. Another quote from the Talmud. It is written, Yom Teruah Yihye Lachem. The biblical description of Rosh Hashanah never says Rosh Hashanah in the Torah. It says that on the first day of the 7th month, you should have a Yom Teruah, a day of Teruah blasts. And we translate in Aramaic that Teruah is Yivava, a day of wailings. And it is written of the mother of Sisra, through the window she looked forth, Vatiyabev, and she moaned through the lattice. Okay, so we have this idea that the Teruah blast is a mother's wail. Tosfot here adds in the name of the Aruch that not just, right, what we've proven so far is that the kind of length or quality of the shofar blast, the Teruah, the central blast on Rosh Hashanah, is supposed to mirror a mother's cry. But not only that, but Tosfot adds in the name of the Aruch that even the law stating that we are required to hear 100 sounds of the shofar is learned from the same text, corresponding to the 100 sobs that Sisra's mother cried. So this mother of a Canaanite general becomes not just the model for the type, the nature of the shofar blast, but also even the number of blasts that are blown. This is actually very surprising, says Rav Amital. Could not the sages have found a better source for the sound of our cry before God on the day of judgment than the voice of a mother, of a Gentile mother? Of course, it is possible that this derivation comes precisely to stress the universal nature of Rosh Hashanah, the day on which all people and not just Jews are judged. But more than that, he wants to argue. Perhaps the sages are telling us that even within the culture of Sisra, and remember the Torah goes to great lengths to tell us not to follow the ways of the Egyptians and the ways of the Canaanites. Those were somehow cultures that were antithetical to the one that God was trying to build. Sisra is the Canaanite. This culture of lies and falsehood. It's possible to find, after searching and sifting, clarifying and purifying, the voice from the heart, a sincere voice that is natural and true and breaks forth from the heart. And there is certainly nothing that more appropriately expresses this idea than a sound expressed by a mother who is worried about the fate of her son, right? So suggesting to us that the model is, again, this most basic cry, a cry that, when you cut through even things of which we're critical, cultures or practices of Canaanite people, you find in the very pit of the heart, the most basic, the most simple cry of a mother worried about the fate of her son. Obviously, in this, on this Rosh Hashanah, we're thinking about so many mothers of so many children who are worried about the fate of their children. Of course, we think about our Jewish family. For me, it's impossible not to also think about folks on the other side. So many bereaved parents, impacted by this war everywhere, and certainly not just in Israel and in Gaza, but around the world. There are many grieving and worrying mothers, and that most basic cry is the simple cry that we're trying to bring out of ourselves on Rosh Hashanah. Yeah, Mama Toby?
Without offending fathers, how powerful would it be to have the names of the mothers under each of the hostages?
Yeah, to think about right, not just them, but the people who are thinking about them. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Okay. In this context, it is not coincidental that the sages compared the voices of two very different mothers, Sisra's mother and our matriarch Sarah. These two individuals may have differed in 1,000 ways, but nonetheless, in this one area, they had something in common. Now, he doesn't explain what he means by the comparison to our matriarch Sarah, but he does have it in what I believe is the original. I'm not sure in the adaptation. They must have had like a word limit, and so a few things were abridged. But in the original Hebrew, he writes that a midrash talks about Yitzchak when he came back from the Akedah, the reading of the second day of Rosh Hashanah, that when Yitzchak came back from the Akedah and he told his mother about the Akedah and that he was nearly slaughtered, the midrash in Vayikra Rabbah says, "Ba'ota sha'a tzavecha shisha kolot keneged shisha tekiyot." At that time, Sarah, his mother, cried out 6 cries in parallel to the 6 tikiyot. Now, the math of the Rosh Hashanah shofar blowing is very complex, but it seems like in the original, more minimal version, there were 9 shofar blasts, 3 teruahs, which is the blast we talked about before, and each teruah had a tekiyah before it and a tekiyah after it, which means that if there are 3 teruot, there are 6 tekiyot, 1 before and after, 2 for each row of 3, and there for each teruah, and there are 3 teruahs, takes you to 6. So interestingly, the sages here in some way parallel the 100, but the teruah blast as Sisra's mother, and the tekiyah blast as Sarah's cries. And the midrash concludes, Amru lo hispika et hadavar ad shemeta. She barely completed those cries before she died. That the trauma of the near slaughter, and there are various midrashim that express this. The more famous, I believe more famous because Rashi quotes it, is that I think it was a malach who told her about the near slaughter of Yitzchak, and it caused her death. The trauma of the news caused her death. Here it's actually Yitzchak, so powerful that he's standing before her telling her, I survived, but I almost died, and somehow understanding, who knows, what he went through, what Abraham was prepared to do. We don't know what the things were that provoked this response, but she utters these cries, and those are her final breaths. So again, extremely powerful midrash. I'm sorry it's omitted in the English, but then we can now go back and read that paragraph. In this context, it's not coincidental that the sages compared the voices of 2 very different mothers, Sisra's mother and our matriarch Sarah. It's kind of ironic that Sisra's mother, her son doesn't return. She seems to survive. Sarah's son does return, but it's her undoing. What's that? Yes, well, right, exactly. Elisheva says, right, in the trauma is different because in Sisra's case, it's not his own father, her own husband, who is the one laying him on the altar until his hand is stayed. Yeah, absolutely. The contexts are very different. And as he says, these 2 individuals, and maybe we can add, and the circumstances may have differed in 1,000 ways, but nonetheless, in this one area, they had something in common. One could conclude, therefore, that the blowing of the shofar expresses that which is most fundamental and basic to prayer, pashtut, simplicity. Now he's going to go on a little bit to develop the second idea of the kind of the kafuf, the bending. But I think this is actually his most central message. Now it's ironic and interesting because we don't use the straight shofar, so we have to acknowledge that. And I think in many ways that's why Rav Amital wants to sort of resuscitate this idea from the Gemara and say, yes, it's not our practice to use the straight shofar, but know that that was a different path we might have gone, and we maybe we preserve it through the idea which it evokes, which is seeking this this simple cry, this simple blast. And I'll just pause for a moment to say about the message. I think it's very resonant, it's very powerful, and it's very needed because I know for me personally, I struggle with the the length and the complexity of the Rosh Hashanah prayers. Like, where is our time to just let out that simple cry? Maybe it's during the shofar, without trying to disturb people who want to hear the blast, and whatever it means, that simple cry. Maybe it's vocalized, maybe it's not, but somehow I think what I take away from Rav Amital is, along with all the statutory prayers, if we leave Rosh Hashanah on, we leave shul on Rosh Hashanah morning, by its case afternoon, not having somehow tried to dig up that what is our most basic, what is our most deep, what is our most simple prayer, wish, anguish, broken heart in this moment of this past year for the year ahead, then we've missed out on a dimension of what Rosh Hashanah is supposed to be all about. That's sort of what I take as this first sort of central point of the drasha. Maybe I'll pause for a moment if anyone wants to comment before we look at the second half. Questions, comments, or reactions? Imagining yourself sitting in the room, is it too much text? Does the message come through? Does it speak to you? Maybe it's obvious. Judy, please.
It makes me think that Hashem is like our ultimate therapist. That you should just, lay everything on Hashem, just vent completely, and He will be there for us.
Yes. Yes. Beautiful. Yeah, I think going back to that sense of, God wanting this sort of cry of the heart, that notion of letting it all out and kind of placing it before God. Yeah, Estelle?
I have a question. Ever since the Shoah, have people actually gone and recited these things and really believed them?
What do you mean, these things?
I mean, a lot of the questions of a cry from the heart, because since during the Shoah it was not answered.
Yeah.
I know people, of course, who have not followed through because of what they experienced.
Yes.
But it's hard to explain. But this is talking as if everybody is in the same mode.
Yeah. 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 I think
cry may mean something different.
yes, that's true. Mama Toby says everyone's cry may mean something different. So first, I think you're right to acknowledge this, and it makes sense a little bit given the audience, right? This is a bunch of yeshiva bacharim, give or take. It's not to say that everyone was a, steadfast and unquestioning believer. Rav Amital was also someone who spoke about the place of doubt and, and wrestling with faith. There's no question, and drew on his own, Shoah experience to think about that. And I think was someone who deeply understood, without putting words in his mouth. I have not seen him write this, but it might be somewhere in his writings, the choices that anyone might have felt compelled or driven to make in the wake of the Shoah or other crises or tragedies that they or people that they knew or saw experienced. So absolutely, there is a point of departure for this sermon, which is a bought-in audience of faith. That is its point of departure. There's no question. So, when we look at it, we might say, how would this land for someone struggling with faith? Maybe we can take Mama Toby's point, the invitation to offer the cry, whatever it is. The cry doesn't have to be, it might be, God, where are you? It might be, I don't know how to see or know your existence in this world, and yet I long for that to still be true. Or maybe it is a cry of anger or anguish, but if the person is showing up to shul or engaging in it on Rosh Hashanah, even in their own home, they're part of the relationship. They're part of the conversation, even if it's coming from a place of wrestling with faith or lack of faith. But I'm glad you raised it, of course, because it reminds us of the bought-in set of assumptions of the speaker and about the audience. I think that's true, and every darshan, I think, needs to decide how much they want to kind of caveat the questions or the assumptions that may underlie. Do you put in a sentence, of course we may all struggle with this, or do you just say, okay, everybody knows that that's the case, and I want to be, full steam ahead. I don't want to alienate, but I also don't want to have to, hesitate. I think those are tensions which sermon givers feel, and it's a choice here, no question. Of course, it's also, we remind ourselves this is one sikha out of so many. There's so much more to explore there.
I always say, I've said this before, but in response to how post-Holocaust can they say this and still believe it? My mother always said post-Holocaust, she didn't believe in God. And then she also used to always tell us how angry she was at this God that she didn't believe in. So you can cry out, saying, I no longer believe in you, but I'm still crying out because I'm angry that you didn't do anything.
Yes.
That's the way of looking at it.
Elisheva?
I think it could be that this is kind of a sermon aimed, I guess, at the other way, that you have these students who are kind of possibly coming at this tefillah with a zeal and with a desire to be complicated, to learn everything, to understand everything, to parse everything. And he's saying, like, hold up, that's actually not what we're doing here. That, like, not you're being too intense about this, but you're being too complicated. That, like, the intensity is in the simplicity. Don't try and reason through it. Don't try to think yourself around it. This is supposed to be an unthinking cry.
Beautiful. That's beautiful. And
Feel it.
Yes, Ruby, go ahead.
Back at the beginning, I'm sort of like confused why there was a dispute at all, because it's normal to bend the mind, straighten the mind. How could you not do both? So why should there have been such a, that you have to do one or the other?
It's a great point. I don't think in this case, even if we land on, which one we prefer, I don't think they're meant to be totally exclusive, right? The language is kind of, I think the language is adif tfei, which one is preferable, your tfei ma'ale, which one is preferable. So you have two opinions sort of saying this predominant mindset is preferable. No, this predominant mindset is preferable. And, in the end, I don't think we necessarily see ourselves as exactly ruling, and we see the value of both of them. So it is a typical Talmudic thing to do, to kind of set this up as a formal debate, even when it's not quite as, concrete or kind of rigid as A versus B, no overlap, no compromise between them. Yes.
So while in the mindset you can have both, in the object of the shofar you have to pick
exactly.
one.
The shofar has to be straight or curved, but the mindset which is underneath it has more fluidity in a sense.
argument, not the argument itself.
Yes. Great. Okay, Ellen, let me see.
But once
back.
a choice is made, a community of faith or a congregation has made somehow
Kind of the same.
that choice.
Yeah, but it
And-
just
and
may
that
be because rams are more
belief,
available than
perhaps.
antelopes.
You
Right.
know, I'm not even sure if the congregation makes it knowingly. Because, as I said, I mean, I never even heard of a straight
Right.
shofar.
Right.
But someone must make that choice.
Right. But yeah, again, I want us to not overread this debate. The Talmud is trying to unpack what might be behind the how would you decide which shape of shofar? But what's underlying it is its opportunity to bring up two different important mindsets of prayer. And as you can see with Rav Amital, he's now about to, having said, okay, so now I've shown you the importance of pashtut, of simplicity. Now he's going to a little bit shift to the other side. I think it proves very much that point that this is very much about cultivating both and the importance of both. So let's go to the second half as I watch our time ticking. Okay. So one could conclude, therefore, and I'll just take a moment to find myself in the Hebrew. It is I didn't get page numbers here. I think it's the very bottom of the second page, and now we're about to flip it over to the back side of the second page. And I'm pulling my Hebrew open here. Sorry, we didn't staple. Yeah, he's more kind of decisive in the Hebrew, where he says, "Tekiyat shofar mivatet et hayesod harishoni shel hatfilah hapashtut." Blowing the shofar, the could conclude, it makes it sound hesitating, but he's much more decisive here in the Hebrew. Shofar blowing expresses that first fundamental principle of prayer, which is simplicity. Rashi, as quoted above, connects the sages' dispute regarding the desired shape of the shofar to the question of one's posture during prayers. This latter issue, too, is a subject of a dispute between the sages. Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Shimon bar Rabbi once sat together when one of them began as follows: "A man who offers up his prayers must direct his eyes downwards, for it is said, 'My eyes and heart shall be there perpetually.' And the other said, 'The eyes of him who offers up prayers shall be directed above, for it is said, let us lift up our heart with our hands to the God in heaven.'" Remember, Rashi had quoted these two opinions as a way of explaining what does it mean to have a bent mindset and a straight mindset. The Gemara does not say these two things there. This is Rashi's attempt to interpret them, and he situates it in the context of what we see is its own independent debate about how you're supposed to direct your head, your eyes when you pray. Are you supposed to be cast downwards or come in some way straight or upwards? In the meanwhile, they were joined by Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yossi. "On what subject are you engaged?" he asked them. "On the subject of prayer," they replied. "My father," he said to them, "ruled thus: a man who offers up his prayers must direct his eyes downward and his heart upward, so that these two scriptural texts may be complied with." And by the way, one thing is striking in this little passage of the Gemara is they just tell him, we're talking about tefillah, and he somehow zeroes right in on the top. It could be 500 different parts of tefillah they could be talking about. He zeroes right in. Is it indicative? Did really they said more, and the Talmud doesn't, record that, or somehow he intuits, or somehow the story means to tell us a very, very central dimension of prayer. What is prayer? It's how you position yourself and how you orient yourself. It's not even exactly the words or the obligations. It's the posture. Because when they say we're talking about prayer, the first thing he comes up with has to do with the posture of prayer.
Sorry.
Oh, Estelle, yes, what is it?
I can't see this. Why do they have to tell you, you have to do this and you have to look down and you have to look up? That's not the way it is. I don't understand that. I'm
Okay, the rabbis
sorry.
were legalists as well as spiritualists, and they saw and understood a system in which the details were very important.
The
And,
words are important, the feeling is important, but if you're standing on your head, what does it?
Okay, I think there's two things. Again, one, let's not get bogged down in the debate, and let's say they're trying to introduce deeper ideas. But along with that, I think they're actually expressing how you position yourself it's real. On the question of, does God hear your prayers even if you're standing on your head? Sure, it's the intention of the heart. But on the question of, is ritual meaningful and profound, and is there something to the intentionality of how we position ourselves, what it does for us? The rabbis say yes, and I agree with them. Yeah, Rabbi Scott. Hold on.
Our feelings are reflected in our physical, in our positions. When you're downtrodden and upset, you're not going to be standing up there like this. I mean, I think it's, to me, fairly logical that your stance has a great deal to do with what you're feeling.
Really?
And I don't think it's, I don't think it's that far-fetched.
Good. We're going to go to Ellen, Mama Toby, and then I'm going to take the reins to get us through to the finish line. Yep.
I mean, I see it more metaphorical. Eyes downward is a humble way to
Right.
approach something.
Humility, right.
And your heart going upward is the concept that as you are standing humbly, you're also uplifted somehow.
Yeah.
Because you're praying.
Yes.
So I don't know that necessarily it means I have to sit there like this, but I have to think that. It means this is metaphorically what
Yeah.
I'm doing.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
standing humbly before God.
Right.
Yes. Yes. Mama Toby.
I think in a way, the rabbis are agreeing with you, because what they're trying to do here is to say, okay, we're talking about the shape of the shofar, but really that's reflecting your posture and your approach and your physical being. But really, that physical being represents what you're thinking, whether it's
Mhm.
direct, whether it's a cry, whether it's, intellectual, so I think they are trying to get to the same thing you're saying, that it's the feelings and the message that's important, but they have to deal with the shape of the shofar. So they're taking these steps to
Mhm.
get back to what you're really saying.
Nice. Nice. Okay, we're gonna keep on going. Okay, so Rashi comments, his eyes downwards toward the land of Israel, because the divine spirit rests there, as is written, my eyes and heart shall be there. Casting one's eyes downward towards the heart symbolizes simplicity, the intention of the heart, the honesty that is demanded in prayer. The heart knows the bitterness of his soul. The heart is the source of pain, of feeling. But Rashi, following the lead of the Gemara, identifies the heart with the temple. My eyes and heart shall be there perpetually. There, referring to the temple of Shlomo on the top of Mount Moriah. So actually, interestingly, on the kind of downwards, which we understood to be the bent, Rav Amital sort of brings it back around to simplicity again, even as it, it's sort of containing both dimensions. The temple represents two aspects of a single idea. It is a source of light. The light that emanates from the temple lights up the entire world and benefits all of its inhabitants. The temple symbolizes the public, society as a whole. The temple was a place where the entire nation would gather without regard for an individual's origin, social standing, or family background. These issues were not relevant because whatever one's background, each person was simply swallowed up in the experience of being an integral part of society. This sense of belonging to the community, good morning, officers, thank you, represented by the temple, then guarantees the resolution of a second issue, a direct consequence of the first, an ability to maintain the appropriate sense of proportion regarding what concerns are primary and what are secondary. When a person involves himself with society as a whole and compares his own troubles to those of his fellows, he ends up with a different perspective that reflects a truer measure of appropriate values. The central concept of the Rosh Hashanah prayers is Betoch Ami Anochi Yoshevet. I dwell among my own people. And here again, this is just a passing reference, but inside the Sikha in Hebrew, Rav Amital develops this as the quote from the Shunammite woman, who, in the way the Zohar explains it, talks about the fact that when Elisha came to her and says, sort of, do you have something you want to say? The Zohar interprets it that, he was telling her kind of she's going to be judged. And she says, Betoch Ami Anochi Yoshevet, I'm amongst my people, meaning like I don't want to stand out. When I position myself inside the community, then I'm sort of strengthened by being a part of the community, and I feel more confident that my kind of outcome will be good. And I also, even with all the struggles that I have, I understand myself as part of something greater. So this is a whole idea which she develops, which is just hinted to here in this one sense. The Chidushei Harim, I believe the father of the Sfat Emet, the Gerer Rebbe, quotes the Ari as saying, on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, one makes requests and prays only for matters of the soul. On the second day of Rosh Hashanah, one makes requests for matters of the body. There is a substantive difference between the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, which certainly requires further clarification. Rav Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin mentions in the name of the Tikkunei Zohar. However, everyone cries in their prayers of Yom Kippur like dogs. Hav, that's a barking sound, but it also means give in Aramaic. Hav, give us food. And the meaning of this is, as it says in Baba Batra, sustain me like a dog. What does this mean? When a person's prayers are entirely directed towards his own personal good, he is like a barking dog. But how different it is when a person's prayers are directed towards society as a whole. Then, even if a request is couched in a language that is personal and directed towards one's own benefit, it is nonetheless intended in the final analysis to help society at large, since the individual considers himself subservient to the needs of society. You may ask something for yourself, so long as you intend to use it so that you will be able to help others. So before we come to the last couple of paragraphs here, let's understand, kind of back up for a moment and put these different pieces together, right? So somehow the position of casting our eyes downward, which also in some way mirrors the bent shofar, along with somehow actually being a sense of simplicity and honesty because it's directed towards the heart, also directs ourselves towards the temple. And the temple is the place of society, of public, of community. And so along with our simplicity, we're also situating ourselves in the context of something bigger, which helps us moderate and contextualize our own prayers, both saying, look, I'm part of something so much bigger. I have that humility or moderation. And also, I expand my own concerns to include the concerns of others, and I see my own needs as not just for myself, but for how they can benefit others. And this is kind of the second movement. First is simplicity, getting to the core, and then second is situating ourselves in the context of the greater community. The Sfat Emet comments, I had the privilege of sharing this up north at YOZ last Shabbat on Parashat Nitzavim, a week from this Shabbat, on the statement beginning of the parasha, Atem Nitzavim Hayom Kulchem Lifnei Hashem Elokechem, that you're all standing today in the presence of the Lord your God. The Sfat Emet says the only way to stand in the presence of the Lord your God is if you are standing in the context of community. And he uses a few simple words. He says, Lahachnitz atzmo el haklal, to bring your individuality into the context of the collective. And that's what he's getting at here. It's we don't deny or nullify our sense of self, but we situate ourself in the context of community. If the goal, last few paragraphs, would simply be spiritual elevation, there would be nothing wrong in requesting food so that one could successfully have this type of experience. Where there's no flour, there's no Torah, right? So we can pray for the physical when it is also, combined with the spiritual. In contrast to an opinion that is commonly heard, it is impossible to separate spiritual problems from existential ones. When a person is sick and his life is in danger, his Torah study and entire spiritual world are going to be damaged. This is true both in the private realm and in the public realm. And here's the only little seeming hint to current events. At a time when an existential threat hovers over the nation of Israel, whatever it was that he was feeling or that was present Rosh Hashanah 1984, this also hurts the kingdom of heaven. Right now, he's gone another step, not just that, the existential and spiritual are interconnected, but our spiritual, weakness also somehow impacts God's experience of the world. May God hearken to our heartfelt prayers and grant us a year of peace, blessing, and growth. So that's Rav Amital Rosh Hashanah 40 years ago. Very timeless message. I think the pieces that stand out to me, again, the ways of using text and amassing a lot of text to further develop a point, but still with the centerpiece being simplicity, not overthinking, as Elisheva said, not kind of attempting to overanalyze or thinking that intensity needs to come from complexity or complication, but that there's an intensity also to simplicity, to reaching down for the most basic prayer of the heart, linking that with the sort of most primal sense of maternal instinct of concern for the welfare and safety of children, and then the sort of situating ourselves not just with that straight simplicity, but also with the turn towards the heart, but also with the turn towards the temple and the collective, and the appreciation of our needs being not just for ourselves, but for the greater, and our physical needs and spiritual needs, individual and collective, being interconnected. Dad?
So I'm going to look at the verse from the paragraph on tzitzis, where it says, "Lo sosuru acharei levavchem v'acharei einechem." Don't go after your eyes and your heart. And Rashi comments there that the eyes and the heart are agents of sin. Eyes see and the heart desires. So what the rabbis are doing in this context of this drasha, they're taking these two agents of sin and saying, use them for good, turn them around, and use your eyes and your heart to enhance your prayers. And one of your prayers being, I'm not going to sin. I don't want to sin.
Yeah.
And so they take the same parts, the same body parts, and turn them around from bad to good.
Yeah.
It's almost like take your evil inclination and turn it around and use it for something good.
Yes. Yes. And in a sense, it feels like part of how that's being done, as Rav Amital takes, I think it's spot on, of course, is actually directing the eyes towards the heart, right? So the eye, when the eyes are outward directed, they, somehow conspire with the heart towards, desires that are less lofty. But if somehow the eyes turn for a time inward to look at the heart, then they collaborate towards a better outcome. And then hopefully they train themselves and each other to then look outwards in a positive way. But I think it's a beautiful connection. And it's fascinating, this pasuk from Malachim about God's eyes and heart. So there's a lot to develop there. Yeah, Ellen?
On page 5, is this really literal? On the first day of Rosh Hashanah, one makes requests and prays only for matters of the soul. And on the second day, Rosh Hashanah, one makes requests for matters of the body.
It's not in the sense that our liturgy is oriented that way. It's it's an interesting idea of this Ger Rebbe about how we direct our thoughts. It's not, I don't think Rav Amital is quoting it as prescriptive, but somehow I think he's introducing it to help us notice that we do have these two different realms, that you could interpret this as describing them as distinct, and separate, but he's understanding that this to demonstrate that they actually interrelate. So yeah, there, you could take it or leave it, but I think it's an interesting idea to, at least the underlying notion that these are things which require focused prayers for each of them. But I don't think they have to be arrayed this way. This is not a
Maybe we
formal
start off
halachic position.
spiritually, that the second day we're so tired and achy.
Right,
We
right,
start
okay,
thinking
right.
about
Maybe
halacha.
maybe right. Maybe it's almost less prescriptive than descriptive. On day one, we're all on the spiritual, and by day two, nebuch, we're more on the physical. Praying for lunch. Yes, exactly. All right, great. Yasher koach, everybody. We'll continue to Rav Amiel next week. Then the following week will be Rosh Hashanah. And then we'll do Rabbi Sharon Brous between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, if I got my dates correct. Yeah. Take care, everybody. Love to mom and dad, and good day to all.
My last thought.